The government and researchers say climate change is not an academic issue. It is a matter of life or death. Does climate change pose an existential threat to us, or are we being alarmists? This should be of interest to you. A clear and present threat to us now, dengue. We're speaking with the Chief Medical Officer to find out what the Ministry of Health and Wellness is doing to reduce the number of dengue cases. I am Andre Jebinson, and Public Interest starts right now.
Mr. Speaker, climate change is one of the more serious issues affecting us as a country, as its impacts are capable of reversing all the economic and social gains we have made. We are currently feeling the effects in terms of the heat wave the country is now experiencing. A sample of data taken from the weather station in all 14 parishes shows that all stations experienced higher extreme temperatures in June this year when compared to June 2018. With more than 50% of these recording increases of 1.5 degrees or more. In some cases, the increase was almost 4 degrees. The report from the Climate Change Service in the United Kingdom noted that the European average temperature for June 2019 was higher than any other June on record, the hottest June ever recorded. Mr. Speaker, you will recall a couple of Saturdays ago in Jamaica, we experienced an unprecedented 102 degrees Fahrenheit. Researchers say these record-breaking temperatures are made 5 times more likely by the effects of climate change.
So what is this issue of climate change? What are we doing? What are we supposed to be doing? And what have we done? For this segment, we're being joined by Dr. Barbara Carby. She is the director of the Disaster Risk Reduction Center at the University of the West Indies. Also with us is Associate Professor of Urban and Regional Planning, Dr. Carol Archer. Welcome to the program, ladies.
Thank you.
So we hear a lot about climate change. We know people in the U.S., people in the world. Jamaica seems to be taking it more seriously now. So we can understand it. What exactly is climate change, and what does it mean to us as a small island state? Dr. Carby.
Well, climate change is a long-term change in the climate indicators for the planet. And there's a natural variability in climate. But the concern now for climate change is that there's a contribution from man which is exacerbating that natural variability of climate. So the emission of greenhouse gases, such as carbon dioxide, for example, is having a deleterious effect on climate. And that deleterious effect is projected into the future to continue.
So is it that we've now been doing more to the natural environment than we have been doing in the past? Because, I mean, humans have been around for a very long time.
Yeah. Yes, we have been doing too much. And that has caused, for example, temperature to increase. I believe it is like a 5 or so points increase in the average temperature over time. And what this means is that where you have the polar ice caps, they are melting at a faster rate. When the ice cap melts, water is released, and as the water releases, you have what they call sea level rise. That's one example of climate change impact. As the sea level rise, where you have coastal areas, settlements along the coast, they will be impacted because as sea level rise, the water now intrudes. So where you would have a beach normally, and you could walk out to the beach, places in Negril or in Hellshire, you no longer can walk. The water is right at the doorstep, so to speak.
Yeah, but they're saying though, NASA is saying that between 1880 and 2007, global average temperatures have risen by 0.8 degrees Celsius.
Yes.
I mean, when I hear 0.8 degrees Celsius, it means very little to me. I don't know if it is a case where 0.8 is a very significant increase, so we need to be worried at this point.
Yes, it is significant, and we need to be worried because I just gave the example of melting of the polar ice cap and sea level rise. And that's just one example. It also impacts on the issues associated with that causes or contribute to the frequency of hurricanes. So you find that, and research has shown that over time, the intensity and the frequency of hurricanes have increased. We have done the research, the data is there. And with the increase and the intensity, of course, it impacts where we are located geographically. We can see the impact of that particular climate change.
Just let me point out something here, please, that the figure you quoted, 0.8 degrees centigrade, is actually an average. So there will be places on the planet that would have warmed more than that, for example. Of more concern, really, because the average is useful in defining a trend. But if you're following the news this year, you'd have heard that sections of Europe, they were having temperatures of 40 degrees
more
centigrade, right? So this is 4 or 5 degrees beyond what they would normally expect as an extreme.
Right.
So one of the things that the climate scientists have said about climate change is that it exacerbates the extremes. It makes the extremes worse. So this is why, for example, we have the matter of hurricanes. We are going to expect more intense hurricanes. Droughts, again, we are going to expect more intense droughts. Also, and many people don't talk about this, but it is very important, the forecast is for an overall drying trend for the Caribbean to the end of the century. So it means we'll have less available water as we go through the century.
So, I mean, I think probably when some people think about climate change, they're expecting this massive explosion or something manifestly happening. And so they're saying, where is it? We've been hearing about climate change for a while, just like we hear Jesus is coming. So people are saying, I mean, what is it that is going to say to us that, okay, climate change is here, it's no longer changing, it has changed?
Well, our practical experience. There is masses of scientific data that supports the theory of climate change. But just think about it. In my lifetime, I used to live in Red Hills. In my youth, December, January, you had to cover with a blanket. You were going to bed in your sweatsuit
and
socks.
Yes,
right?
Yes.
Now, you don't even need a sheet.
Oh, you have to use the fan.
and you know how to buy a fan, which was unheard of before. So if the average person just thinks about what has happened over their lifetime, that experience, their observation, those are now actually validated by the scientific data that the climate scientists are putting out.
So what is it that we need to be doing? I mean, we talk about behavioral change and all of that. What do we need to do to slow it down? Is it money that we need? Is it the will, political will? What?
Well, behavioral change, certain behavioral change. So, for example, where we build, what we build with.
Yeah, no, you'll get to that eventually.
Well, that's my area of interest. So, for example, we have to be mindful. We are a small island developing states, and we tend to, most of our settlement patterns are along coastal areas. That's, commercial activities are there, and the transportation network supports that. But given the evidence of the impact of the melting, the sea level rise, we now have to give serious consideration to where our settlements are, particularly settlements where you have important centers of economic activities, commercial activities, political activities. So you need to ensure that those areas are safeguarded. In places like Montego Bay and Negril, that's our economic hub as it relates to tourism, how we build, how we retrofit, because we're there already, yes? So one is a question of retrofitting, so that within the next 10 or so years, the hotels that were maybe a mile or two from the beach don't all of a sudden end up in. And we actually noticed that in Negril recently.
I don't understand what you mean by retrofitting, because they're there already, like you said. If more are to come, they're going to be there as well.
So that has to be taken into consideration. Where do we give permission for hotels to be constructed and the type of hotels that are being constructed? We have to ensure that the permission that we give, the consideration for tourism development, is mindful of and it's not long-term effect, it is immediate effect coming as a result of climate change.
Yeah, but easier said than done. When a man coming to Jamaica to say, I'm going to invest in your country, and you start putting up all of these, what would be considered barriers or restrictions and so on, say, I'll go somewhere else with my money.
Well, we have seen elsewhere, in the Maldives, for example, and in other Pacific islands, small island developing states that rely on tourism, that they have had to now take into consideration the fact that they are going to be impacted. So where they locate their hospitals, how they construct their hospitals, how they construct their hotels, they now have to take on board some innovative approach so that they are not as impacted by the current issues associated with climate change.
What else do we do?
So, for example, if we can follow up on the example of a hotel, which is unfortunately already on the beach. What can be done is that you could remove some of the vital infrastructure for that hotel and put it higher up. Because remember now that we have sea level rise. For a hurricane, you're going to superimpose on top of that wave action, your storm surge. The net effect of that is that the sea will actually come further in than before.
And higher.
So you may have to relocate some of your equipment to the first floor or the second floor. Your ground floor, you would leave for, entertainment, the bar, although some of my friends tell me that's important
that's
infrastructure
more
as well,
when you're on vacation. Yes.
So the non-essential items or activities would be at ground level, and then you would relocate some of the more critical things up if the building is there already. But just let me say that planning for climate change means thinking in the future.
Yes.
And I don't think we are thinking in the future as much as we should.
I hear you, Dr. Carvey. So we'll pick up on that point when we come back from this break. So first break on public interest. Stay with us.
The recently developed Construction Industry Policy of Jamaica, CIPJ, also seeks to encourage good environmental management through the incorporation of a reward system in the tendering of government contracts. Some of the environmental protection measures outlined in this CIPJ include encouraging the integration of environmental issues into the development, design, and processes of construction projects, the adoption of a nature-based approach through the use of resources that have limited impact on the environment, and the adoption of green building techniques, which include the use of resources that will have limited impact on the environment.
Whereas in 2017, this Honorable Senate debated and approved a motion for the banning of single-use plastic bags. And whereas this motion contributed to the government of Jamaica taking a progressive decision to impose a ban on certain materials made out of plastic, and whereas this policy decision was designed to stem the environmental degradation taking place across the country, and whereas we have seen the effects of environmental degradation contributing to climate change, thus causing global warming, floods, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and various anthropogenic disasters, and whereas the effects are likely to continue unless radical measures are taken to correct these existential problems, be it resolved that this Honorable Senate call upon the government to embark on a process of actively monitoring developments taking place where issues of the environment and climate change are concerned, and that this Honorable Senate establish a special select committee to actively monitor, make recommendations and reports to members on developments are taking place in the Jamaican society as it relates to the environment and climate change.
Welcome back to Public Interest. I'm Andre Jebens, and I'm speaking with Dr. Carby and Associate Professor Archer, and we're talking about climate change. Before we went on break, you're saying when we speak about climate change, we're not future planning.
Yes.
Expand on that for me, please.
All right. I'm going to give an example that every Jamaican can relate to. The character of Kingston is changing. We're seeing that where we used to have single-family dwellings on a quarter acre of land, we now have multiple family dwellings on the same quarter acre of land. So we are putting up apartment buildings and we're putting up townhouses. What have we had to do that? We've had to take out large trees and other types of vegetation.
And paved over areas.
We have now put in concrete, steel, and paving.
But we're planting 3 million trees over 3 years.
Well,
not enough?
Don't distract me. Let me just go back to this. We can discuss that afterwards. Right. So one of the things we know is that urban areas have something which they call the heat island effect. Urban centers are much hotter than rural areas. One of the ways of combating high temperatures is with shade trees. Trees are also important for the hydrological cycle. They are an important driver of rainfall. Now, we are looking at, for the future, higher temperatures and less rainfall. But we are taking out the very element which is supposed to combat those on our behalf. So if we were really thinking about looking down the road and saying we're going to have an increase in temperature and then we're going to have less rainfall, we would actually be trying to preserve trees as much as we can. That is not to say you can't put in more high-density development, but you put it in bearing in mind that you still need shade and you still need trees to drive rainfall. And let me just add one thing, because I checked this. There has been scientific research done on the ability of different types of trees to contribute to the absorption of carbon dioxide, to production of shade, and to production of rainfall. Palms are somewhere near the bottom of the list. They do not provide the same benefits in terms of shade, nor in terms of carbon dioxide entrapment, nor in terms of contribution to the hydrological cycle. So what most cities which think about these things in the future are doing is that they're putting in some palms, but also large hardwood trees that will in the future help us to combat those deleterious effects of climate change. Absolutely. We aren't doing that. We are taking out our trees, replacing them with palms and shrubs. And then, oddly enough, we then say we're going to plant 1 million trees. But why would you not save 500,000 trees, which are already well established, growing and part of the ecosystem?
Yeah,
then still plant 1 million trees.
But it goes to that balance that, I mean, governments and countries try to find, because there's a need for housing, and people want housing in the corporate area. And that's where they're taking down the trees, and that's where they're putting up the apartments on very small lots and moving any form of vegetation. So, I mean, I hear you, but how do you balance those two?
Sacrifice 1 or 2 units in each development so you can have more trees. I mean, well, I am not a planner, and I will defer. I will defer to Carol. I will defer to Carol on this. But there must be ways in which you can design urban centers, taking into consideration green space.
Yes, and we have excellent examples. Yeah. I mean, Singapore, and I was recently in Singapore, and that, for me, is the most ideal examples of how they have preserved and incorporate the natural environment in their design. I mean, that is actually a policy. That's actually programs and initiatives supported by the government and the people of Singapore, and you see it throughout the city, where in the design, it's not just to put up high-rise. It is to design and build those high-rise that allow for tree preservation, that in the design itself, you have space within those high-rise for water runoff to preserve, for green space, and for, they call it the biophilic design. There's a whole new concept of how you can design a city to combat the impact of climate change, and Singapore provides a very good example.
When you look at greenhouse gases, about 60% of that comes from energy production and transportation. So what you're outlining to us now seems to be not the major contributing factor to global warming. So is it that we're maybe looking in the wrong direction? Maybe we should be looking at our transportation system and pay more attention to
that is part
energy
of it,
production.
Because, well, yes, when you have it ought to be the intention that you increase density. So not for a minute are we saying lower the density, because we know that in a compact city, that's one of the best approach to address issues associated with climate. But what does a compact city mean? A compact city means that you also provide the necessary public transportation system. So it's not enough to increase the density, but you still have people relying on private motor cars. Yes. The issues are not going to be resolved in that manner. So you need to have concurrently effective and efficient public transportation system, not the kind that we have at this point, not the reliance on route taxis. We need to have integrated public transportation system.
Public transportation, which means that it moves large numbers of persons in a small space.
Right. But Dr. Carby, how much are we contributing, as in a small island like Jamaica, how much are we contributing to our own, being dramatic demise? Because we know that there are other countries far above Jamaica who are contributing more to this global warming issue. Is it a case where Jamaica in its own geographic space is contributing significantly to the erosion of the beaches and the temperatures in this region?
Okay. So when we look at global carbon dioxide emissions by country, countries like Jamaica are, relatively speaking, are contributing very small amounts to the global situation. I mean, even if we were to cut back to zero emissions, wouldn't have much of an effect on the global temperature. Having said that, I do think that we need to consider the local environment.
Yes.
So this slogan about think globally, act locally is very relevant because we are going to feel the effects more than many of the developing countries who are contributing more.
That is correct.
So we must be concerned about mitigating the effects. So we should be pursuing both adaptation and mitigation strategies for climate change. And that includes things like reducing vehicles by whatever means, a more efficient mass transit system, proper development options where we build in harmony with nature, adequate public awareness programs so that the population at large can understand the issues and can buy into this concept of climate change adaptation and mitigation.
Yeah.
But it seems like a lot of what we're asking Jamaicans to do run counter to what we are known to, because I don't want to drive up on a bus. I want to drive my own big car because it is how I show you that I am achieving something.
The average person, I can tell you based on research, will take public transport once it's efficient and it's timely.
Right.
I would readily park my car if I know if you go to places like, the big cities, most persons do not drive their car. They take public transport. But the public transport is reliable.
Yes.
It's efficient, it's safe, it's clean. Once we are there with our public, I can guarantee you the average person will park and take public transport. They will.
For example, what could be done is that you could have centers where you could leave your car. So I drive from my house to point A, I park my car at point A, I take the mass transportation system to work. Many days when I'm at work, my car is not moved. I don't drive my car in the day when I'm at work, so I don't need it to be at work with me. If I could park my car somewhere and get from that point to work and back to that point, and then drive home, wherever it is, that would work fine. I saw recently where in Paris, they had constructed these large underground parking garages. They're not going to use them to grow mushrooms. Why? There's so few cars, they don't need the parking space
because they
anymore.
have a good public transport system.
People are using the public transportation system.
All right, we're almost out of time, Dr. Kirby. Sorry to interrupt you, but so where then do you see us going? Where do we need to go? And I mean, your expertise is in risk reduction. Where do we need to go in order to be in a zone where we don't have to be worrying for very long periods in the year that, we could be extending the hurricane season, or we could be having these adverse weather elements for protracted periods?
So we can't influence those factors, the length of the hurricane season, the intensity of the hurricanes, and so on. What we can do on our side is to ensure that our planning takes into account the risks that we're going to face. Our construction takes into account the risks that we're going to face, and then that our contingency planning takes into account the risks that we're going to face. So the first planning I mentioned was physical planning, environmental planning. But also now we know that our contingency plans, what the public would call the disaster plans, more and more must take into account the fact that we'll be having more extreme events.
Okay.
And I also believe that we need to consider incentivizing, whether it's the developer, the hotels, the citizens, for activities that would reduce the impact. So, for example, once we have an effective and efficient public transport system, incentives for persons to utilize, whether it's, discount cards or, however, there are numerous examples throughout the world where persons who use for a period of time, they get the discount. Or for developers or hotelers who would assist with the planting of mangroves or the expansion of mangroves in certain areas rather than destroying mangroves to put up hotels.
All right.
Can I leave with one quotation?
Sure.
That shows how important trees are. 1 acre of trees can consume enough carbon dioxide, which is equivalent to driving a car for 26,000 miles, and produce enough oxygen for 18 people to breathe for a year.
Wow.
Right?
Impactful.
Wow.
Yes.
Impactful.
All right, Dr. Kirby, Dr. Archer, thank you very much. And when we come back, we'll be taking a look at this issue of dengue, also a matter to do with the environment. All right, stay with us. Public Interest returns. Welcome back to Public Interest. I am Andre Jebinson. It's a social media segment, and we had asked you on social media, what are you doing to protect yourself from dengue? On WhatsApp, Makita Bond says she's using a mosquito repellent spray. Shanice Bukal says, and also Dwayne Johnson, they both say that they're using anything to protect themselves. Chelsea is saying also on social media that she's closing the windows early and not leaving water in containers around the yard open. And Shane Brown says, Shane sent a picture of one of those rackets that you use to kill mosquitoes. And Brian says, well, the main thing to do is to make sure that there is no breeding sites around the house. We're also now being joined by the Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Jacqueline McKenzie. Dr. McKenzie, it's a trying time for the Ministry of Health. First of all, give us an idea of, when we say dengue, what precisely are we talking about? Because we've had different bouts of diseases and viruses. What separates dengue from any other?
Okay, so dengue is a viral disease, and it is transmitted by the mosquito, the Aedes aegypti mosquito. So, of course, when you have rain, you have a lot of mosquitoes, and therefore there's increased transmission of the dengue virus. Now, persons who get dengue, there are actually 4 types of dengue, 4 strains, and therefore you can get dengue 4 times, okay?
Oh.
So you have the strains type 1, 2, 3, and 4.
Sorry, you can't get the same type twice?
No.
Okay.
So far, what we have seen is that you cannot get the same type more than once.
Okay.
But every time you get it, it has a potential to be more severe. Okay. So when you get dengue, not everybody will show symptoms. Some persons will have absolutely nothing at all wrong with them, but they have the virus in their blood, and therefore if mosquito bites them, they can infect the mosquito, and the mosquito can transmit the dengue to other persons. So then you have the rest of persons that are going to get sick. So you will have persons that get a very mild illness, and they will just have fever, joint pains. They may feel a little bit lethargic for a few days, and then they're fine, okay? And then you have some persons who will go on to have a more severe form of the disease. And for these persons, these are the persons that we're very concerned about. One, for them to recognize that this illness is moving to a next stage, okay? So we ask persons that if they're having their symptoms that are going on for more than about 3 days, then they should visit their healthcare provider to get an opinion as to what is happening, okay? We want to make sure that they don't have any warning signs of increased severity. So in particular, we're asking about abdominal pain. We're asking about any vomiting, any other symptoms that would suggest weakness, would suggest decreased blood supply to areas of the body, such as confusion, just listlessness that is just not improving. Because what happens with severe dengue is that there is leakage of fluid outside of the blood vessels into the surrounding tissues, and so persons become dehydrated. Dengue can also directly affect certain organs in the body, like the liver, the brain, and can cause those organs to fail. So we have to be very careful as healthcare providers that we pick up these warning signs early, and that these persons are monitored in hospital.
Are there people who are more prone to these severe effects of dengue or no?
What we have found since last year, we have been looking very closely at the severe cases that we have seen, and of course the dengue-related deaths. And we have found that, one, our children, over 50% of the persons who died from dengue were under the age of 14. Okay, so children are affected more severely. We also have found that asthmatics, persons with sickle cell disease, those 2 disorders presented prominently in the cases that we saw of dengue-related death. But we also recognize that even if there was no death, that persons with comorbid illnesses generally, okay, the more vulnerable persons, the immunocompromised persons, the very young, the very old, are always going to suffer more from any disorder that is happening. But really and truly, asthma, sickle cell disease, have featured prominently in those cases that we have seen.
All right, so when we talk about numbers, what are the numbers we're looking at from January until, say, October?
Well, up to October the 14th, we now have, and that is from January this year to October 14th, we have 5,023 suspected cases.
5,023 compared to what last year?
Last year, for the entire year, we had 1,054
Wow.
of suspected cases. Now, I want to point out to persons that this is just the tip of the iceberg, okay? Doctors will notify cases to us if they have a suspicion. They see a patient and they're thinking, oh, this looks like dengue. Cases will be notified, but not everybody notifies, okay? So therefore, a doctor may be in their private practice or in a health center and they're saying, wow, I'm seeing a lot of dengue cases, but the ministry's numbers are not reflecting, because if I'm seeing 50 cases, then every doctor must be seeing 50 cases too. So it must be a bigger number than this 5,023 cases that we've had for 2019. So we recognize that we are not reporting every single case. But what it does, it gives us an idea of the trend, because it's the same persons that report usually. And so therefore, if in January they were reporting 1,000 cases, and then in February they're reporting 500 cases, we would know that the cases are falling generally. If they reported 1,000 in January and then 2,000 in February, we know that the cases are going up. But it probably is more than the 1,000 or 2,000 that were reported.
So a private physician can actually confirm a dengue case, or it has to go through the Ministry of Health?
Okay, so we try to stay away from the confirmed cases because we don't use confirmed to say that it is dengue. Once it meets the case definition, okay, that is set out by the ministry, then it is classified as a suspected case of dengue. Why we cannot use the confirmatory test is because the confirmatory test will only pick up the virus within the first 5 days of the illness when the fever is on. Okay? After that, the virus disappears, or it becomes so low in the blood that you don't pick it up. So somebody could have had dengue, but the confirmatory test, which is testing for viral particles, the actual virus, they may do the test at day 7 and it comes back as negative. So we don't look at that negative test to say that the person does not have dengue.
Okay.
We looked at what it is that they presented with. What was the case? What was the case? Is the case definition met? And those persons are dengue. But to go back to your thing about your question about the GPs being able to confirm dengue in the private practices. So the confirmatory tests presently we send away to the Caribbean Public Health Agency for the confirmatory test. So that's where we get our confirmatory or positive confirmed cases from. But there are other tests that we use, which are what we call antibody tests, where we test for the body's response to dengue. Okay? So that response in the blood will be there during those initial 5 days and will remain there even when the virus has gone. So the response is still there and we're able to pick it up more frequently. However, we have to recognize that once a person has had dengue, some antibodies are present and they're always present. So even if you're not having dengue now, you can pick up a positive antibody test. Okay, and that is why we say that.
For how long though?
Forever.
Forever?
Yes.
Oh.
Okay, so there are two types of antibodies. I don't want to confuse you too much, but there are two types of antibodies. The IgG antibody, which is an antibody that once you've had dengue and you do a dengue test, you're going to come back positive for IgG. The IgM antibody rises in the acute setting. Okay, so when doctors do the tests in their offices or even at the private labs, these are the tests that are being done. And there's also another test that tests for some viral particle, the NS1 test, okay? But these tests, the actual reliability, first of all, you have to know how to interpret the test, okay, to make sure that you're looking at the correct positive line to say that it is a positive test for dengue now.
All right. All right, Dr. Mackenzie, we're going to take a break. You're watching Public Interest, a lot more to talk about. So let's take a break, and then we come back to our discussion. Welcome back to Public Interest. I'm Andre Jebinson, and I'm being joined by the Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Jacqueline Bisesa Mackenzie. Dr. Mackenzie, before we went on break, we were speaking about a lot, but I want to go back to that 5,023 cases that we have confirmed so far this year. Where in Jamaica are those cases coming from mostly? Because I know people west they're actually complaining about. So is it that there's a concentration of the cases?
At this time, from about, I would say, August, September, now into October, where we're seeing most of our cases coming from is certainly St. James, Hanover, Trelawney, and St. Anne. And recently, St. James and St. Anne is where most of the notifications are coming from. And we're getting the feedback from the hospitals.
That's normal, because, I mean, I know mostly cases coming from this side of the island, Kingston and so on.
When we started out in January, we were seeing cases mostly in Kingston and St. Andrew and St. Catherine.
Right.
Okay, and when we talk about the number of cases, we have to look at, we have to make a difference between the actual numbers, because the population is greater in St. Catherine versus St. James. It's about 2 times the population. Right. And so we have to look at the number of cases per population. So per population, St. James and St. Anne are having the highest number of cases. But if you look at the actual figures, you may see that St. Catherine and KC are still having quite a number of cases. But St. Anne, St. James, we're getting the feedback from the hospitals, we're getting the feedback from the persons in private practice that they are overwhelmed. There's a number of cases that are presenting now. Now, the thing is that it really comes back to the prevention, okay?
Yeah, before we get to prevention, and I'm going to make a note of it, but when you're at the stage now of being overwhelmed, private practices and so on, what do you do at that point? Because people are turning up, and people are turning up with the symptoms in droves. What do you do at that point?
I think, I mean, the patients present to us as healthcare workers, and we have to manage the patient that is in front of us. Now, it is very important how it is, what is the message that we pass on to the patient. Because, as I said, many persons are going to present with a mild illness, but I can't predict which one is going to get worse, which one is going to become severe, because any case of dengue has the potential to become severe. And so as a healthcare worker, I have to bear that in my mind. So I have to say to the patient, okay, so right now I see you have fever, you have joint pains, it appears that you have dengue, okay? I'm going to treat you with medication for your fever and your pain, and we stick to only paracetamol. We don't use medications that has the potential to cause further bleeding or any bleeding. So we stick to paracetamol. So we'll treat the patient, and we say you need to make sure you drink a lot of fluids, rest, and this should settle down in about 4 to 5 days, okay? Now, what we also have to communicate to the patient is that dengue has the potential to become severe. And so therefore, if you find after day 3, when I think you should be getting better, that you are getting worse, day 4, day 5, you're getting worse, then you need to come back or you need to go to the hospital. If you find that you are developing abdominal pain, vomiting, then you need to go to the hospital. I think persons have to be aware that if the symptoms start getting worse, we now need to monitor you more closely. And that monitoring is best in hospital. Now, persons may say, okay, I'm going to go to the hospital, but the hospital is overcrowded and, I can't wait. We really, the bottom line is that if it is that we're unable to monitor the patients, then we're not going to be able to pick up when they really become severe.
Right.
What we have found in the last set of dengue-related deaths that we reviewed, that over 50% again of patients died within 24 hours.
How many people have died so far this year?
So, well, up to September the 30th, we had 41 dengue-related deaths. By October the 14th, now we have 48 dengue-related deaths. Okay, so remember again now, the notifications are different from those that we classify. So persons will notify quite widely. So we had 135 cases that were notified to us as of September 30th. And by October the 14th, we had 149 cases that were notified to us. However, those cases, at the point of notification, we would not have had test results. We would not have had the benefit of doing a post-mortem. We would not have been able to look through the notes, interview persons to find out, is this really dengue related?
Right.
So there's a process that we go through to make sure that we classify the death appropriately. And so up to October the 14th, we have 48 cases.
And could be more.
No, I'm going to say that the cases that we have reviewed so far for September have been severe cases. By the time they have presented to us, they have really been in a bad state. And so therefore, this whole monitoring is important. Once persons present and you're going to see that they're going to die within 24 hours, it usually means that at that point, there's not very much that we can do. Certainly, we should go all the way out and try to support, but usually there is significant insult to the body, and it is difficult to turn it around in that time.
Which means prevention is perhaps the key, which is where you wanted to go earlier. I know that the ministry has allocated about $350 million for this campaign, this fight against dengue. There are people who are saying it's simply not enough. And I also know, based on having worked in the Ministry of Health and having worked on another project that dealt with mosquitoes and so on, partnership is the way to go, because the government won't necessarily find the funds.
Right.
So, I mean, what are you doing on that prevention part of the whole dengue?
Well, I mean, behavioral change is what is important here, okay?
Easier said than done. People don't change.
It is easier said than done. And what happens is that it's not sustained. Because, when we are out there and we are really campaigning there, you will see the numbers go down. But the people do not continue. So if you visit a home today and we pick up several breeding sites, you go back and you go through and you destroy them and you speak to the persons, you go back a month later and it's the same thing.
Probably have more.
Maybe even more.
Yeah.
But I mean, it really is about sustaining, especially now. Now in this time when we're seeing higher number of cases, and this is not something that seems to go, first time when we have dengue outbreaks, it would dry up completely. We are not seeing that dry up completely. We're seeing a baseline for us that is higher than normal. And so therefore what it means is that we have to sustain our activities right throughout the year.
Are you getting access to people's homes? Because I know that's also a problem. People just don't want the Ministry of Health or any other agency in their homes.
Right. So yes, we have problems in terms of persons accessing, the vector control workers accessing homes. Now, I would really say it, and I was talking to somebody recently and they were saying, but looking in my yard, there's nothing around. However, when you speak to the vector control worker, it gives you an opportunity to tell them your concerns. Okay, so if you have other problems that you see that there are breeding sites elsewhere in the neighborhood, point it out to them. You know, I mean, you'll be so surprised that when you walk around the home, just the type of plants that you have will accumulate water, even if you don't have it in a pot. Just how the leaves are shaped will accumulate water. So there are various things that the vector control worker can point out to you. I have persons that tell me that their house is locked up all the time, and yet there are still mosquitoes. But what about the toilet bowl?
Right.
What about where you keep the toilet bowl cleaner? You know, when you use the brush and you put it in that container, is it empty? Have you looked under your kitchen sink? Is there any moisture in your drainer? You know, there are several things and there are several hints that if you tell your concerns to the vector control workers, they can help to advise you.
How about the number of vector control workers that you have? Because like I said, I mean, I have a little knowledge about it. The Zika Ears project would have closed earlier this year. They are no longer a part of the cadre of people that you have to go to these homes. You had, what, 1,000 people or 800 people? Do you think that you need more than that number? Because, I mean, based on the heavy rains that we've been having, and I know how they work sometimes, they will visit a home, a yard, like probably once a month or so.
Well, it would be foolhardy to answer a question to say, we don't need more. More is always better, okay? And what we are going to do at this time is to try to sustain this activity, okay? So,
is it still seasonal or is it now year-round?
Well, so far for this year, or we will go straight up until December. Now, come January, we know that the numbers are not, traditionally the numbers do not go down in January. So our intention is to embed the temporary worker program into a more permanent thing, and also to increase, because right now we have a cadre of permanent workers and we have a cadre of temporary workers. We're trying to increase the number of permanent workers, and then we are looking towards sustaining the temporary worker program.
Okay, there's also the mosquito sterilization pilot project that the ministry is embarking on. Can you give us any update on that? And is it something that, I don't know if there's hope in that project? I mean, well, let me have your answer.
Well, I'm not prepared to answer that one.
Okay.
Because I don't have a present update on that. I know that it is something that we're working on, and we are looking to release the sterile mosquitoes. But in terms of a timeline, I'm not able to update you on that. No.
All right, so in the closing moments then, what would you say to householders? Because what people don't realize is a lot of this can be taken into their own hands. And they are the ones who are actually contributing to mosquitoes breeding and you know, the viruses and the diseases that follow. What would you say to householders?
Well, everybody.
And you can also make a pitch to practitioners as well.
Right. So everybody has to take precaution. It can affect any and everybody, and even if you are here and you don't appear to have dengue, you could be carrying the virus. So therefore, you still have to prevent the mosquitoes from being in and around your home. You have to make sure that you destroy all the breeding sites that are there. Now, for the healthcare provider, many of the general practitioners in particular are feeling a bit overwhelmed in terms of the number of cases that they're seeing. I'm going to ask them that they must make contact with the health department, okay, to let the health department know what is happening. Because in making the report, the health department is also able to say what areas are being affected, okay? So it's not every area that is going to have the same concentration of cases. But if one doctor is seeing quite a number of cases, and the doctor is really more concerned about the patient in front of them than to write up a notification. But if you just ask somebody in your office to call the health department and let the health department come in and have a talk and see what is happening, they can identify what are the problem areas that they can target in terms of the vector control workers and in terms of the fogging. Okay. So that is important. That connection is important.
All right. So when we asked our friends on social media, some people say they're using repellents. Others say they're using that, I don't remember the name of it, but the Zappo. But a cheaper method sometimes is a mosquito destroyer. Is that safe for homes?
Well, I mean, traditionally in Jamaica, we have used mosquito destroyer. I mean, persons burn green bush to get the smoke to run the mosquitoes. I mean, every individual will have their own problems with different things. So in cases you have asthmatics in the home or persons with respiratory illnesses, then of course they're going to be bothered by the smoke. So you would have to respond accordingly. So some people, you have the vape mats that don't release the smoke. So some persons use that. The thing with the mosquito repellent is that instead of you're protecting yourself from the environment, you cannot, using the mosquito destroyer and the vape mats, you may not be able to cover the entire environment that you're in. But if you protect yourself by using the repellent, even if you walk outside, the repellent will work. If you have on a long sleeve, then close your doors when it's certain times of the day, early morning, and coming up to about dusk in the evenings, between 5, 6 o'clock thereabouts, close your doors to keep out the mosquitoes.
Okay. All right, Dr. McKenzie, thank you very much. And thank you for watching this edition of Public Interest on behalf of the entire production team. I'm Andre Jebinson wishing you a good evening.